Chapter 26. When Horace had the campsite set up, they spread out Halt's bedroll and lifted him gently onto it. At first, he protested, waving them away and attempting to rise to his feet. But his strength failed him before he had even managed to sit up, and Will saw a quick flash of fear in his eyes as he sank back again. "Maybe you'd better carry me," he said, and they did so. Horace arranged one of their tents as a lean-to shelter to shield Halt from the sun. Will looked around, studying the sky and the weather. "Looks like it'll stay fine tonight," he said. "We'll keep him in the open. Fresh air might be good for him." He was guessing, he knew, but he was convinced that the interior of a stuffy little one-man tent would not be the place for Halt over the next few hours. He was conscious that the slight smell of corruption was still present around the wound, even though it was nowhere near as strong as before. It might well become suffocating if Halt were confined inside a tent. Almost as soon as they moved Halt, he lost consciousness again. He muttered and tossed in his sleep, but at least now his breathing seemed more regular. Will sat hunched beside him, watching like a hawk. At one stage, Horace laid a hand on his shoulder. "I'll watch him for a while. You need to rest." But Will shook his head. "I'm fine. I'll watch him." Horace nodded. He understood how his friend felt. "Let me know if you need a break." Will grunted in reply, so Horace busied himself making a thin broth from their provisions. He thought they could feed it to Halt when he woke again. Broth was good for injured men, he knew. He kept it simmering in the edge of the fire and made a simple meal for Will and himself, using flatbread and some cold beef and pickles that they had been carrying. He took a plate to Will, who was still sitting, staring at his teacher. The young ranger took the plate and glanced up. "Thanks, Horace," he said briefly. Then his eyes went back to Halt, and he began eating the food mechanically. Around sunset, Halt's eyes opened again. For a moment or two, he looked around, puzzled, as he tried to remember what had happened, why he was lying here with Will huddled in his cloak beside him and dozing. Then it came back to him. He glanced down at the loosely bandaged arm. He could see the swollen, discoloured flesh and feel the throbbing heat that shot through it. A cold hand clutched his heart as he realized what had happened to him. He made a small sound in his throat, and Will's head shot up as he instantly came awake. "Halt!" he said, relief evident in his voice. The older ranger made a small gesture with his right hand. A short distance away, Abelard's ears pricked up and he whinnied briefly, moving closer to the recumbent figure. The small horse hadn't moved more than a few meters from his master's side in the past 3 hours. Halt grinned weakly up at him. "Hello, old friend," he said. "Been worried about me, have you?" Abelard moved forward and leaned his head down to nuzzle Halt's cheek. Halt said a few words to him, speaking in Gallic, as he often did when he was talking privately to Abelard. Watching the simple interaction between them that said so much about the bond they shared, Will's eyes filled with tears once more. But this time, they were tears of relief. Finally, Halt gestured with his uninjured arm, gently shooing Abelard away. "Off you go, boy. Will and I need to talk a little." The horse backed away a few paces, but his ears were still up and he was still alert to any move or noise that Halt might make. Will edged closer and seized Halt's uninjured hand. The return grip was surprisingly weak, and he felt a thrill of alarm. Then he dismissed it. Halt had been close to death. He would take some time to recover. "You're all right now," he said. Halt glanced around, trying to see more of the campsite. "Is Horace here?" Will shook his head. "He's out setting snares. There's a pond nearby where he thinks ducks might settle at dusk, so he's gone to try his luck." We're getting short on fresh food. He dismissed the unimportant matter of Horace and their provisions with a quick gesture. My God, Halt, it's good to see you awake again. We thought we'd lost you for a while, but now you're on the mend. He caught the quick flash of apprehension in Halt's eyes, instantly masked, and suddenly a horrible doubt struck him. Halt, you are all right, aren't you? Of course you are. You're awake and talking. Maybe a little weak, but you'll get your strength back, and before you know it, we'll be... He stopped, aware that he was babbling, aware that he was talking to convince himself, not the bearded ranger who lay before him. There was a long silence between them. Tell me. Halt hesitated, then glanced down at his injured arm. He drew a deep breath before he spoke. You understand that the bolt was poisoned, don't you? Will nodded disconsolately. I guessed as much. I should have thought of it earlier. But Halt shook his head gently. No reason why you should have, but I should have at least considered it. Those blasted Genovesans know all about poisons. I should have realized that it wouldn't be beyond them to dip their crossbow bolts in it. He paused. I vaguely remember going a little crazy. Did I think the Temagi were after us? Will nodded. That's when we really got worried. Then you galloped off in the wrong direction and fell off your horse. You were unconscious when I reached you. I thought you were dead at first. I wasn't breathing? Halt asked. No. Then you gave a sort of huge sigh and started breathing again. That's when we thought to look at your arm. It only occurred to me then that it had been bothering you all day. He briefly described the condition the arm had been in and, at Halt's urging, what actions he had taken. His teacher nodded thoughtfully as he described how he had cleaned the wound again and applied the wormweed-derived salve to it. Yes, he said thoughtfully. That might have slowed it down a little. Wormweed tends to have a few other properties besides reducing pain. I've heard that some people have used it for treating snakebite, which is a pretty similar thing to this when you think about it. And it worked? Will asked. He didn't like the way Halt paused before he answered. Up to a point. It slowed the effect of the venom, but the victim still needed treatment. The trouble is, with this sort of poison, I don't know what the correct treatment might be. But Halt, you're improving. You're so much better than you were this afternoon. I can see you're recovering. He stopped as Halt laid a hand on his arm. That's often the way with these poisons. The victim seems to recover, then he has a relapse. And each time, after each bout of consciousness, he's a little worse than before. And gradually, he stopped and made an uncertain gesture in the air. Will felt he was staring into a deep, black hole before him. The realization of what Halt was saying constricted his throat so that he could barely talk. Halt, he choked. Are you saying you're... He couldn't finish the sentence. Halt said it for him. Dying? I'm afraid it's a distinct possibility, Will. I'll have bouts of consciousness like this. Then I'll pass out again. Each time I'll take a little longer to recover. And each time I do, I'll be weaker than the time before. But Halt! The tears gushed from Will's eyes, blinding him. You can't die! You mustn't! How could I manage without... Suddenly, he was beyond speech, and his body was racked with great sobs. The tears coursed down his face unheeded. He hunched forward on his knees, rocking back and forth and making a terrible keening sound in the back of his throat. Will! Halt's voice was weak, and it didn't penetrate Will's grief. The older ranger took several deep breaths and gathered his strength. Will! This time, the familiar bark of authority was there, and it cut through to Will's consciousness. He stopped rocking and looked up, wiping his eyes and streaming nose with the hem of his cloak. Halt smiled at him, a tired, crooked little smile. I promise I'm trying my best not to die, but you have to be prepared for it. The next 12 hours or so will be the critical period, I'd say. If I feel stronger tomorrow morning, who knows? I might have beaten it. Dealing with poison isn't an exact science. Some people are affected worse than others, but I'll need all my strength to fight it, and I'll need you to be strong for me. Red-eyed and ashamed of himself, Will nodded. His back straightened. Weeping and wailing would do nothing to help Halt. I'm sorry, he said. I won't let that happen again. Is there anything I can do for you? Halt looked down at his injured arm. Maybe change that dressing in another hour or so, and use a little more salve. How long since you put it on? Will considered the question. He knew that the salve couldn't be used too often. 4, maybe 5 hours. Halt nodded. Fine. Give it an hour, then put some more on. Not sure if it'll help, but it can't hurt. Maybe a little water now, if you've got some. Of course, Will said. He unstoppered his canteen and propped Halt up so that he could drink slowly. The bearded ranger was experienced enough to know that he shouldn't gulp the water greedily. He sighed as the water trickled through his parched mouth and throat. Oh, that's so good, he said. People always underestimate water. Will glanced quickly at the campfire, where the coffee pot sat in the embers to one side. I can get you some coffee if you like, or soup, he suggested. But Halt shook his head, lying back against the saddle, padded with his own folded cloak that was serving as his pillow. No, water's fine. Maybe some soup later. His voice was sounding tired, as if the effort of their conversation had exhausted him. His eyes slid shut and he said something, but he spoke so softly that Will had to lean forward and ask him to repeat himself. Where's Horace? He asked, his eyes still shut. He's setting the snares. He was going to say, I told you that, but he realized that Halt's mind had begun to wander again, just as he had forecast. There would be a brief period of lucidity, then he would slowly sink back into unconsciousness. Yes, of course, you told me. He's a good boy. So's Will, of course. Both good boys. Will said nothing. He simply gripped Halt's free hand a little tighter, not trusting his voice if he were to try to speak. Can't let him face d'Epargneux, of course. Thinks everybody fights by the rules, young Horace does. Again, Will squeezed Halt's hand, just to let him know that he wasn't alone. He hoped the contact would register with Halt's wandering mind. D'Epargneux had been the evil Gallic warlord who held Halt and Horace captive years ago, when they were searching for Will and Evelyn. The poison had taken his mind again, and he was no longer living in the present. His words died away to a mutter, and he drifted into sleep. Will sat and watched over him. The breathing was deep and even. Perhaps he would recover. Perhaps a good night's rest was all that he needed. Will would redress the wound in an hour. The wormweed salve would work its magic. In the morning, Halt would be on the road to recovery. Horace, returning shortly after dark with a brace of ducks, found Will crouched beside his teacher. He took in the tear-stained face and the red eyes and gently led him away to the fire. He gave him coffee and flatbread and made him drink some of the beef broth he had prepared for Halt. When Will had recovered his composure a little, he told Horace all that Halt had said about the poison and the possible outcome they faced. Horace, determined to keep a positive frame of mind, assessed Halt's condition while Will cleaned and redressed the wound. But he said he could get better, he insisted. That's right, Will said, replacing the linen bandage over the wound. There seemed to be no improvement. But it hadn't deteriorated any further either. He said the next 12 hours would be critical. He's sleeping peacefully now, Horace noted. None of that tossing and turning. I think he's getting better. I definitely think he's getting better. Will, his jaw set in a determined line, nodded several times. Then he replied forcefully, You're right. All he needs is a good night's rest. In the morning, he'll be fine. They took turns watching over the stricken ranger through the night. He slept peacefully, without any sign of distress. Around 3 a.m, he woke briefly and talked calmly and lucidly with Horace, who was on watch. Then he fell asleep again, and it seemed that he was winning the battle against the poison. In the morning, they couldn't wake him.